Okay, Bulavanaka from Fiji, and welcome, bienvenue to you all. Thank you very much for joining this session on assessing the risk of turtle extinction in the Pacific to inform regional conservation approaches. I'll just start and introduce myself in a minute, and then hand you over, once I've just introduced the program that we're working through, introduce you to Nick Pilcher, who is leading the work on this component of the BIEM initiative, and our esteemed expert panel, who will give their views on how this work can be used to inform future conservation in the Pacific of all the species that occur here. So let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope that's working. Great. So this work is funded through the Pacific European Union Marine Partnership Programme, or the PEUMP Programme. And I am Jamie Davis. I'm appointed by SPREP to lead the Bycatch and Integrated Ecosystem Management Initiative, which is key result area 5 of the programme. The PEUMP programme overall is running from July 2018 through to December 2022. As I said, it's funded by the European Union, but also the government of Sweden. It's a 45 million euro programme that promotes sustainable management and sound ocean governance for food security and economic growth, while addressing climate change resilience and conservation of marine biodiversity. It follows a comprehensive approach integrating issues related to oceanic fisheries, coastal fisheries, community development, and marine conservation, as well as building capacity of partners under one single regional action. Let's find my cursor again. So the PEUMP programme is being delivered by several crop agencies, SPC, FFA, ourselves, and USP. And we are focusing on key result area 5, which is coastal and marine biodiversity and conservation. You can refer back to that slide for a bit more detail on the other elements of the work. So the BIEM activities are split down to 8 main activity areas, both at a regional scale, but also in 5 focal countries. We've got under marine spatial planning and marine protected areas, the IUCN are working with us in Fiji and the Solomon Islands to support those governments implement their respective priorities in relation to marine spatial planning and protected area conservation, marine protected area conservation. I'm leading the work under the integrated ridge to reef ecosystem management and climate change adaptation components, which are delivered in Fiji and Vanuatu, supporting government directly on their priorities in relation to those aspects of work. And then we've got a number of activities under a wider banner of fisheries bycatch mitigation and protected marine species conservation. So under assessment of endangered species, we've got Nick Pilcher doing this work, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail next. But we also have development and implementation of bycatch mitigation strategies, and that's both in offshore tuna fisheries and other industrial fisheries, as well as inshore fisheries. Capacity development through a research grant, the Louis Bell Scholarship, support to community monitoring and for protection of endangered species, and finally capacity development on non-detrimental findings for CITES parties. And we're working with Thierry Mar, consultant to deliver that work. So there's a lot of detail there, and you'll find on our exhibition page booth a lot more information about each of those activities. And throughout the program through to 2022, we will be updating the BIEM page on the PEUMP programme website, and there is the link there for you to visit. So do visit the exhibition booth if you haven't done already. But more importantly, and to the focus of today, I want to hand over to Dr. Nick Pilcher, who SPREP has appointed to lead this work. And he will talk about what's been done so far, what's still to do, and then the panel members will give their views on how this work can be used to inform conservation of turtles, both at national and regional scale in the future. So I'll just stop sharing my screen and hand over to Nick. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot for the introduction, Jamie, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to viewers around the world. It's nice that you would join us today. And just a brief introduction from my side. My name's Nick Pilcher. I run a private non-profit organization based in Borneo in Malaysia. And I have worked on sea turtle conservation matters over Asia and the Pacific region for several decades. And as Jamie says, I'll be leading this bycatch assessment. But it comprises several other components, which I'll go into a bit more detail as soon as I can solve some of these technical issues. There we go. Here we go. Right, there we go. So technology for you, I love it. So SPREP has contracted this work out to me, but of course it's a much, much bigger program. And what I'd like to do today is sort of briefly introduce how the risk assessment process is going to work, what we're doing at the moment, how other programs all fit into this. And we thought it would be a really, really nice way also is to bring together a series of panelists who would be able to speak to this program and to be able to identify areas where they saw strengths in it and things that would be useful back at home, and things that might need to be added to make it even stronger and more robust. So I'd like to introduce the panelists that we have with us today. We have Irene Kelly from NOAA Fisheries, who has not yet joined us, but we're hoping she'll make it back from fieldwork in time to be with us today. We have Job Oppu, who is an independent consultant, currently doing some work for FAO, but also has quite a lot of other work lined up as well, as I understand. We have Donald Aromalo, with one smallback in Vanuatu, and he leads this great group of community monitors for sea turtles. So it'll be an interesting perspective to hear from him. We also have Simon Nicol from the Pacific community, modeling guru, bycatch guru, somebody who's going to be able to look at that sort of one side of the equation that's really lacking in terms of being able to get some of this data correct. And we also have Vera Talilotu at the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Disaster Management in the Solomon Islands. And so I think that we've got a really nice, interesting group of panelists that are going to speak from a variety of different viewpoints and give us some ideas on how they see this moving forward. So I'm not going to run over this too much because Simon already introduced where this sea turtle risk extinction project fits. What I'd like to do is sort of narrow down the idea of risk extinction into a very, very simplistic formula. At one side of the equation, you have how many turtles are we putting into the system? And at the other side of the equation is how many turtles are being taken out of the system. And to give the number of turtles that go into a system, well, that can be dependent on the number of clutches of turtles, clutches of eggs a turtle lays, the number of eggs in that clutch, the survival rate of those clutches, the number of females that are available to deposit clutches on beaches. So all of these independent and individual little numbers contribute to that one side of the equation. Then on the other side of the equation, the number of turtles being taken out of the system, well, that could include things like disease and natural mortality. It could include bycatch in coastal fisheries. It could include bycatch in larger commercial fisheries. It could include direct take or collection of eggs in different parts of the system. So you've got, on one side of the equation, the number of turtles being produced. On the other side of the equation, the number of turtles being taken out. And if the net removal exceeds the amount of turtles going in, well, then there is a potential risk of extinction. And that risk of extinction will vary. It might not be, oh, we will lose all turtles to the system. It could be a localized extinction. And one example of that is the leatherbacks of the Western Pacific, where Malaysia had a very large leatherback nesting population that has now gone extinct. Now, there are still leatherbacks nesting in the Western Pacific, in Indonesia and in Papua New Guinea, but in Malaysia, they've gone extinct. And so we need to be able to also look at whether the extinction risk occurs at a localized level or whether the extinction risk occurs at an ocean basin level. A really good and simple, well, I say simple, example of a extinction risk assessment is the IUCN Red List. And the IUCN Red List looks at numbers of a species and what changes have happened in those numbers over time, and uses that as a way to assess risk of extinction. Or it could look at the amount of habitat that's available to a species, or it could look at whether or not there's been some modeling done to look at extinction risk. So the IUCN Red List is a good example of a method to calculate the threat of extinction. So in this process, in this particular project, the key steps right at the very beginning is starting with a literature review to compile as much information as we can so that we can populate both sides of that equation, so that we can understand how many turtles are going into the system, but similarly so that we can understand how many turtles are coming out of the system. And that data needs to be processed and put into a format that can be clearly and easily explained. But there are several collaborative projects that also contribute to this process. One of them is a program on assessing rates of bycatch and direct take that's being led by this SPREP project and also by WWF Australia. And that will involve the use of questionnaires amongst local communities to see if we can get a handle on just how many turtles might be taken out of the system on an annual basis. Another issue that could affect numbers of turtles going into the system in a healthy manner is whether or not climate change and temperature regimes are changing to the point that eggs might not be hatching, or we might get biased sex ratios. And so under the Cool Turtle project, which is again another project that's being implemented via SPREP and Tierramar and also by WWF Australia, this will deploy data loggers at a variety of sites across Asia Pacific to collect temperature on nests and correlate that with ambient temperatures so that we can determine whether or not we might be getting biased sex ratios from hatchlings. And as I said, all of this comes with this massive review of the existing literature. And let me tell you, there is loads of literature coming out of the Pacific. Some of it is in small little national reports. Some of it comes out of big international and regional assessments. But there is a wealth of information that needs to be distilled and put into a format that can be used in a model to look at risk extinction. Following that, of course, there is the development of a model that would be suitable to assess whether or not these parameters that we've now just determined and assembled, whether or not those would be leading to or potentially lead to the risk of extinction. And of course, you can't just develop a model and believe that it's the best on the planet and that it works. So that model would go out to an expert panel of marine turtle scientists and modelers who could provide input and feedback on strengthening the model. Ultimately, at some point, publishing it, because publication at least gives it this validity that it's been reviewed by outsiders and that it's representative. Once we know that the model works and that the numbers and the assessments that it gives us are correct, then of course we'd go ahead and plug in the numbers for different species in different management units across the Pacific. And it can't end there. We can't just end up with a risk assessment and not get it out and roll it out across local communities, local governments, national governments, and also at a regional level to see where this whole model would fit in helping people understand what the threats to extinction are and what might need doing about it. So just to give you a very quick update on progress, literature review is an ongoing process. It probably won't end even while this process is going on. The same thing with assembling spatial data. So how far are turtles moving? That might be through satellite tracking, or it might be through flipper tag returns, these sorts of things. As I mentioned, the bycatch and direct take, I've been helping groups put together these questionnaires that are just about to be rolled out in Fiji and in Tonga and Vanuatu as well later on. Some of this work has already been done in the Solomon Islands and in Papua New Guinea. Job Oku helped with some of that work in the past. The Cool Turtle project, I can tell you that data loggers will be going out in 3 countries probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks, which will allow us to collect data over the coming nesting season. And there is also a lot of data in Vanuatu that has been collected as part of other projects on turtle catch and bycatch, and so there will be a review of that work to see how that data can fit into this process for the model. And then the model itself, and I'm going to openly state, I am not a modeling person. This is not my area of expertise, and so I reached out to one of the marine turtle community's strongest and most respected modeling gurus, a gentleman called Marc Girondeau, who's in France, and he has been extremely gracious in helping us start to put together this model. We're very excited, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So as part of the data that we're gathering, we're looking at where turtles are moving, what sort of trade and harvest is going on. On the left side here, we've got satellite tracks of turtles moving from Palau down into Indonesia. We've also got studies on genetics that let us understand the different genetic groups. And this is important because if one genetic group gets lost, there's a very small chance that that population would be rebuilt from outside populations. So understanding genetics is important. Understanding population trends is extremely important. And this is some of the data that I think is going to be the most lacking, that we have data for some places, but we don't have data for all places in terms of long-term trends. So what I mean by that is a population going up in numbers? Is it going down in numbers? And if it's going down or up, what are the drivers behind those trends? We know a lot about where turtles are nesting across the Pacific, so a lot of that information is very, very well established. What is probably a little bit more challenging is understanding the impact of bycatch. And in this case, I'm referring to bycatch at the big industrial fisheries level, international fisheries level. And what I'll say to this slide is that keep your ears peeled for when Simon comes on in a little bit, and he's going to be able to explain some of the challenges with understanding bycatch and interpreting the numbers of bycatch that we have reported in some of these big fisheries. So to give you just some ideas of what would happen, what's some of the numbers that need to go in to this model, we're looking at numbers of nesting turtles, maybe the trend in those numbers, or whether the numbers is going up or down, a remigration interval, and that is how many times or how many years between individual nesting events does it take a female to return and deposit another clutch of eggs. Clutch frequency, which is the number of clutches deposited in a season. The nesting success, and this is nesting success of the female. So when a female turtle walks up on the beach, does she actually end up laying eggs, or is there a log in her way, or is there a wall from a development or something like that? Hatching emergence success, so how many hatchlings emerge from a nest? Are the sex ratios balanced? Do we have the right numbers of males and females? And then we need to know a little bit about survival. So once you reach adulthood, what's the probability of survival? And the same at different life stages, and that might be broken down into subadults or juveniles, or it might simply be you're an adult or you're not an adult, and it might be that simple. And range and genetics. And so the point about this is to understand as much as we can from the biological side of the turtles in question. Predation, so this is now, what are the threats? What are things that could take turtles out of that equation? It could be hatchling predation on beaches, it could be direct take of turtles, it could be collection of eggs, habitat loss. You can see the list here. There's a whole suite of reasons why turtles might be taken out of the equation. And so these are the two sides of the equation that we're looking at. And on the right-hand side of these little tables, you can see where we plan on sourcing the majority of that information. So the Virtual Turtles project, this model that's being developed, as I said, is being spearheaded by Marc Girondeau. And the idea behind this is, look, turtle biologists, there's loads of them across the planet, and studying every little minuscule detail of turtle biology. We know an incredible amount about that. What we know less about is the dynamics of these populations. What makes a population go up or go down? What combination of threats can lead to a faster decline than others? And so the idea behind this model is to use life history parameters and populate the model of every single one of those things that I was talking about before. So rather than simplifying it down to sort of temperature and just looking at temperature, the idea would be that this would look at temperature and the impact of that on hatching success, and the impact of that on sex ratios, and the impact of that on future survival and reproductive potential, that sort of thing. So the model will be rather complex, I'm going to say, and I think that that's the great part about this, is the opportunity to look at this from an ocean basin standpoint, and to be able to look at all of the different things and combine them into one single model that would give us an idea of risk extinction. And these are just some examples of, we have a whole bunch of really, really accurate models today that would tell us things about sea surface temperature and its impact on nesting, or its impact on sex ratios and that sort of thing. And imagine being able to combine all of those things to come out with a very holistic picture of what's going to happen with sea turtles. Mark's planning on doing this in stages. So first looking at some of the biology, and then adding layers and layers and layers. So if you would, you could think of it as an onion that has all these multiple layers. And when it's finally all done, it's going to give us a really, really robust picture of where, what the extinction risks might be for turtles, either at the management unit, genetic management units, or whether it's at the entire ocean basin unit, or whether there are specific issues in specific places. This is it's a collaborative project. The data is coming from multiple sources. It's not just about me collecting data and giving it to Mark and him coming up with the number. As I mentioned before, there's the Cool Turtle project, there's the Direct Take and Bycatch project, but there's also a lot of work in liaising with partners that have access to information that might not be generally available in sort of like the bigger, wider picture. And so rather than it be something that's hidden, I want it to be something that people can communicate with me and people can offer suggestions and advice and information, guidance, and that sort of thing. So towards the end of this, I will put up some contact details for you, hopefully. And if not, then you can get them through my profile on this platform. But in sort of like a first step to be able to look at feedback and get people's first impressions, I think our panelists who are with us today are going to be the best source of that initial feedback for me. And so I am going to stop sharing my screen somehow. There we go, stop share. And I'm going to, let's see. I can see Simon, I can see Job. Donald, you around? Vera, you around? Look. So how did we have this as an order? Who was next? Does anybody remember? I did have an order for this. Just bear with me 1 second while I figure that out. 1 second.
Nick, just while you're doing that, would you like me to put the polls up?
Yeah, let's get one of those going while I look for this.
Okay, well, Nick's looking for that. Just on your screen, you can see there's a poll, and we're going to make those polls go live. It's an opportunity for you to have a go at answering those questions, and we'll see just the variation of thoughts on that. Are you good to go, Nick?
There's 3 polls up now. If you could have a look at all 3, please.
How come I can't see them? Just curious.
You're focused on delivering the speech.
All right. So look, Irene hasn't been able to join us yet, so I'm going to turn to Job. Job, if you don't mind, you've done a lot of work throughout the region, and how do you see this being of value? What challenges and that sort of thing? I'll turn it over to you.
We've done a lot of work. We've progressed in some areas, while in some areas we really haven't progressed at all. In terms of awareness, I think we've progressed very well in terms of awareness. People are aware. But in terms of policy, legislation, and the support from the government, they still have some other priorities, and they haven't really come forward, unlike probably Vanuatu, Fiji, where the countries are smaller and they more try to address all issues that obviously can't wait to address those issues, and they're working along in getting the government to really come out with programs that can assist in conservation of the marine species. So yeah, and then you still have people out there that the information is not reaching, and they're still hunting for marine turtles. Subsistence farming, not in some of the traditional obligations and stuff like that. So yeah, we still need a lot of work to do. In terms of species extinction, I think we maybe having an issue with the leatherback turtle. Basically, because the numbers have declined over the years, probably it's a more regional issue. But then on a national front, we have the climate change that has really affected the northern coastlines of PNG.
I'm just saying we're only hearing
the beaches changing. We see a lot of king tides destroying the beaches where the turtles are supposed to be nesting, so they find it hard to get on the thing that is coming out now. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to hear you. It's coming in and out.
Joe, maybe switch off your video. Yeah. Oh, we've lost him.
All right, so while we wait for Job to come back to us, Simon, if you don't mind, can I turn to you and for your insights on this, particularly on the bycatch side of things, you know, that other side of the equation where turtles are being taken out. So I'm going to pass it over to you, but I'm also going to share that screen the way you asked me to. So there, and over to you, Simon.
Yeah, so just a quick check that you can hear me speaking.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. And I guess in addressing the questions in a couple of ways that you had asked of me is, you know, first off, how do we think in terms of the work that SPC does in, or the Pacific community does in supporting the Pacific Islands commercial fisheries in the region, and in particular the tuna fisheries. I think it's worth reiterating that the risk assessment approach provides a really useful framework for fisheries managers to understand the impact that the interactions between turtles and fishing gear can have on particular turtle populations. And because the framework can scale the magnitude of impacts across different sectors and processes, it also provides a really useful tool for setting expectations on the effectiveness of particular actions or measures that may be implemented. So as an example to that, if the mortalities attributed to fishing are quite small in comparison to the total mortalities for a species, the framework actually makes it explicit that although minimising and eliminating those fishing mortalities is really important, when we start thinking about how we measure those and reporting against those, and fisheries managers, like most managers, are always looking to be able to have a responsive monitoring system where they're able to look at what measures they put in place and what effect they have. If we know that the effect is likely to be small, then in cases such as that, it may not be easily to detect the benefits of the work that you've done unless those other sources of mortality are also managed. So the framework provides a very, very useful element of not only knowing how large the impacts are or gauging how large the impacts might be from a commercial fishing operation, but they also aid or provide a lot of benefit, should I say, in being able to understand how you might monitor and what your expectations from your monitoring and your management might be. So just to jump to that question of monitoring, one of the things that is presented in this figure that Nicholas has put up is the Fisheries Observer data, and we use that quite a lot to be able to come up with estimates of not only the distributions of turtles, but also what the total mortality due to fishing may be. And I think for everyone who's not familiar with Fisheries Observer data, it's worth understanding that it provides a number of different things. So if a turtle is observed, it provides a record of the presence of the turtle in that location. It also provides information on the type of interaction, i.e., you know, sort of was the turtle simply observed or was it interacting with the gear? If there is an interaction with the gear, what type of interaction is it? Was it an active one where they may have, such as in a line fishery, been actively taking baits, or may have been a passive aspect where it may be tangled with the gear? It also provides us with information on the fate of the individual after that interaction. Yeah. So was the turtle alive or dead after the interaction? And we can take that a step further, that if it was alive, what was the condition of the turtle on release. And if the turtle happened to be landed, it also tells us information. We can obtain information on the life history of the individual, such as its size, its sex, and a whole range of other things that feed into the types of models that Nicola has been presenting. From the observer data, and I'll just touch on this a little bit. So the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission has a number of conservation and management measures in place for fisheries observers. For the purse seine vessels, which occupy the surface fisheries, typically operating in the tropics between 10 degrees north and 10 degrees south, they require 100% observer coverage. So for that very narrow band, and and these are net-based fisheries that are fishing in the shallow waters of that tropical band, we have 100% observer coverage. So if you think about that in terms of data, an independent data collector, for a very narrow band of the area, there is the opportunity to get very good information around what the interaction rate is between that purse seine fishery and turtles. The other fishery, for the main fishery in the area, which is the longline fisheries, which pretty much cover the entire area, and the figure that we can see on the right-hand side here, particularly the bottom figure, shows the distribution of effort for longline fisheries between 2003 and 2016. And we can see that covers the vast majority of the Pacific Ocean area. The only side but from a fisheries observer coverage perspective, the only requirement is a 5% coverage rate for those fisheries. And so when we look at that bottom graph, and if you look at the top graph, which is actually showing where that the observer effort has been for the last, for that same period between 2003 and 2016, we can see that there's actually quite a mismatch between the effort that's put in terms of the longline fisheries, but what we see in terms of not only the spatial distribution, but the intensity of coverage of the observer coverage as well. And so we wind up with a mismatch that occurs. And so in that context, for those longline fisheries, our observer coverage is not truly representative. And there's a chance that, or should I say, not just a chance, what we see if we look at the left-hand side of this slide, and we can see a table that has in the far right columns some estimates of what turtle interactions were during the period of for that same period, 2003 to, or in this case, 2016. This is looking at the purse seine fleet, and even there we can see in the purse seine fleet with high coverage rates, we see quite a lot of variability between what is the median estimate and what are the lower bounds and what the upper bounds are. When we take even less information on that with the longline fisheries, that uncertainty in terms of our ability to estimate what that interaction rate becomes very uncertain. And so, you know, part of the battle we have in being able to provide good advice and good input into things like this risk assessment is what is the true extent of the interaction between fishing gear and these turtles. What that means for us in terms of the real reduced representation is that we tend to have a lot of confidence in the trend that the data is telling us, but we don't have a lot of confidence in what the magnitude of those interactions are. Which I guess leads to a couple of things and some other nice applications that come from trying to feed these data into things like the risk assessment, is it makes it very obvious that increasing observer coverage on longline vessels would be a very sensible outcome that you could take to try and get better estimates of what our turtle mortality are or is. But we could also be smarter. And the nice thing of the risk assessment approach, and Nicola has touched on this in the way that it compiles all the information, we could actually be smarter and stratify our observer coverage to ensure that the areas where turtles are most likely to occur, so if we understand their distribution and their migration patterns, we can ensure that our observer coverage is representative of those areas. So we're maximising the observer coverage that we have to ensure that we get the best possible data that we can from observers. I thought I'd just leave that there, Nick, just to give some further background to the analysis that's going in, but also some of the underlying data from the commercial fisheries perspective.
Thanks such a lot, Simon. That had me writing half a book as you were going through that, and I really appreciate that you could share how some of the data that's out there might be misleading if we don't interpret it correctly. Like you said, we have a massive mismatch between the amount of effort in, say, the longline industry compared to the amount of observer effort in that same industry. And so we're probably missing a whole bunch of it. I love the point you made at the end on stratifying that observer coverage based on the best available knowledge we have on distribution. And I've made a big note to myself that should be one of the big things that comes out of this that would help you later on in your process. So I really appreciate your comments. And I've noticed that there's a couple of questions coming up on the screen, and one particularly directed to you. But what we'll do is we'll just finish going through the talks with our panelists, and then when we finish with that, we'll come back and we'll direct questions to everybody. I hope the audience will accept my wish to just hear everybody's point of view first, and then we'll come back to the questions. So I think now's a really good time. So we've heard from this side of the equation where turtles are being taken out of the equation. But Donald, you have some really good experiences working with local communities in Vanuatu, where actually they're doing completely the opposite and protecting nests, and the communities are involved. And sometimes I look at these big international programs and think, well, this is great from a SPREP perspective or a European Union perspective, but how does it boil down to local communities, and how can something like this help you in the work you do, or how can something like this better inform local communities? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, in Vanuatu we have, we have these local monitors living back in the communities, and then we have to train them on how to look after the sea turtles. We didn't do only training, but we have to go back to the communities, and we have to do a lot of awareness with the people. We have to make the people they aware about the importance of the turtles in Vanuatu, because in most of the islands, turtles are very important to the community. So we told them that if you want your tradition, your customs to be still effective in the future, it is very important now to conserve sea turtles in our area. So a lot of the people in the communities, they are aware of the taboos that the government put the fisheries and enforcement regulations, and a lot of the community people they very they work with their monitors to conserve turtles in the area. And if they spot someone killing turtle, then they have to call me back in Broadvilla, and they say, oh, we spot someone killing turtle. Yeah.
And how long has this community monitoring program been going on? I mean, it's pretty unique across the Pacific, right?
Yes, it started back around 1995, which is the Pacific year of the sea turtles. So that is when the Watchball Park going around the communities around North Evati and then collecting information. And then they wrote the play and then go back to the communities performing the play. And that is when they start to get the attention of communities to try and protect turtles around the area.
And just another question that I had for you in terms of, so let's say we come up with a model, and the model tells us that populations are in decline, or that something needs to happen. how would local communities react to that? Is that something that would help, or is that something that they'd see as some scientific process that they weren't involved in, or something like that? How can we better involve local communities in a program like this?
Okay, in the communities, we try to get the communities to be involved in the activities. Example, we do turtle surveys in the nesting beach, and we tell the communities that that the nesting areas are very important for sea turtles. If you see a lot of turtle coming in and nest, it means that your nesting beach is really good. But if you see that there are no more turtles coming in to nest, it means that you have very poor turtle population around your area. So that is something that a lot of the communities, they become up to realize that in the past, they have a lot of turtle coming in to nest in their beaches, but now only a few turtles coming in again and nest. So that's something that makes them, they really want to work with the turtle monitors to conserve turtle around the area.
I think it's a really inspiring story that Vanuatu can share with the rest of the Pacific. I remember from my time working in PNG that it wasn't the local communities that were responsible for the decline of leatherbacks. It was actually big industrial scale fisheries that were operating in other parts of the Pacific. And so one of the challenges was, of course, to get communities to see that they could contribute to a conservation program. But what we'll do is I'm going to move on and just close off the discussion part with some feedback from Vera, and then we can turn to questions, because I see there's quite a few interesting questions coming up from the participants. So Vera, if you wouldn't mind just sort of rounding out this discussion with your thoughts on how can something like this be translated into national programs, and then also how do we strengthen or move this forward, even at a regional level? I'd love to hear from you on that.
Thank you, Nick. I think from having this, first, all this important data and information gathered, especially from these models that we have, we plan to have here, and then at the same time having these community inputs in terms of data and their innovative approaches in terms of marine turtle monitoring. This gives us back into how the national government responds in terms of information in decision making. So one important point is that it will also assist or support the government, the national government, in terms of updating or reviewing the legislation, in terms of prioritizing what is important or what is the priority in terms of putting forward what's important to assess the risk of the extinction of this marine turtle. The other point I want to raise here is it's important that this kind of initiative and the models will also support the greater number of communities in the island nations, knowing that we have different legislation and policies in different countries in Pacific Island, and we also have regional frameworks and platforms in which we tend to report to and we affiliate to, and so these information will assist national governments, stakeholders and partners in terms of strengthening their monitoring and also regulation and also enforcement activities. So I think I want to put across another point here in terms of what the Vanuatu communities we've learned from them. One of the important areas which also will contribute to this is actually having these nesting sites, given the data and information that they have, the rich data, the knowledge in terms of the cultural values, the connection. Since these sites or these areas are also probably customary owned, it's important some of these sites probably will need some form of formal protection or restriction in some level. And this will also support this undertaking into how this will support and improve the assessment undertaking.
Excellent, thanks. And that last point you made, where you've got a cultural area or areas protected under cultural traditions, and then requiring some sort of a legal protection as well. I know that in Solomon Islands you're working towards that. I've seen several really cool examples, but I think that that's another example that could be maybe taken up by other countries around the region. All right, so look, we have I think about 10 minutes left, and we've got quite a few questions coming in. So I would like to, is it Karen or Anissa? Maybe you would like to pose the questions to the panelists or to me, and we'll take them as they come.
Sure. Simon, the first question's for you from Rick Hamilton. So he's interested in how to account for turtle bycatch numbers in longliners regionally, given bycatcher turtles is rarely reported in logbooks and there's very limited observer coverage.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's a really good question, and I guess that's what I was trying to emphasise in my discussion about the longline observer coverage. The work that we've done to date would suggest to us that we have, with the observer coverage that we have quite a degree of confidence in the trend through time that observer data in terms of our estimates of mortality and interaction tell us, but we have very little confidence in the magnitude of those. I think one of the nice things of the risk assessment approach is it allows us to test what the consequences of different levels of that magnitude might be. And that in itself winds up being an education process for trying to, in certain circumstances, increase the enthusiasm for changing what those observer coverage rates might be.
Thanks, Simon. Donald, the next question is for you from Lisa. She's asking, how do you think community monitoring and illegal take interact? So in areas where there's illegal take happening, do you think community monitoring is a good option?
Now that we face a lot of challenge by some of the illegal activities. So we work with the Fisheries Department to try and train some of our monitors to become fisheries authorized services in the communities, so that they can deal with the people that involved in illegal activities with turtles.
Cool, thanks, Donald. Nick, we got a question for you from Rob Howard. So for the spatial data gathering and the synthesis, are you relying on TREDS or are you gathering the information from individual groups?
The answer to that is both. I'm relying on TREDS, and we've got some great information back on sort of dispersal and that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of other work. There's satellite tracking work. There's some really good work that's been done out of the NOAA office in Hawaii, looking at completely mapping all of the nesting beaches across the Pacific, so that the data is going to be of multiple levels. And TREDS is a big resource, but it's not the only one out there. And there's a lot of other reports. And a lot of this also relies on me being able to send out emails and people respond and provide information. It's when you don't get a response that it becomes a bit more challenging.
Thanks, Nick. Simon, there's another question for you from Karen, actually. Given that feminisation is an issue with increasing temperature, do we know if there is a bias in fisheries bycatch? Is sex of bycatch animals recorded?
Yeah, another good question, and it's one that's likely to be increasingly prevalent in the way that we undertake the risk assessment. The short answer is we have very little information on sex, and that's largely because as the observer coverages have increased in the Pacific region, so have management measures to try and to release turtles in the water and not bring them on deck, whether that's a longliner or a purse seine vessel if they can. So from a method of trying to increase the survivorship and the less human handling of these turtles, it also comes at the consequence of not actually being able to gain some of that other information, such as sex.
And if I could just add to that, that sex is only able to be determined in sea turtles visually if they are large adults. And I presume that a whole number of the interactions that are occurring aren't just with adults, but also with sub-adults and juveniles. And in the majority of those cases, you would not be able to determine sex through external characteristics. Personally, I think at the moment, the only way to deal with this is to accept that there would probably not be a bias in any other way than maybe by proportional numbers. So what I mean by that is if a population has 50% males and 50% females, then probably you'd expect that sort of bycatch or incidence of take. But we're finding that many populations have a greater proportion of females, and that's just nature because the males have to invest less in reproduction. And so I would expect that we'd be able to look at that and maybe potentially looking at sex of turtles being taken as being a function of the proportion of males and females in that population.
Thanks, Nick. We've got another question for you, Donald. Do you think, so this is from Elise Huffer, do you think it's possible to work with communities on mapping their cultural relationships with turtles, such as like the genealogies, stories, sand drawing, that sort of thing? And are you aware if it's actually happening in Vanuatu?
Yes, we have in Vanuatu. Some of the communities in some of the outer islands, they have some sort of sun drawings for turtles, and we have also a lot of islands that they have tradition that link with turtle in the area. So yeah, I think it's very important to all this.
Well, thanks. We've got a general question for the panel from Agnetha from Solomon Islands. So government's role in providing policy and the legislative basis for supporting turtle conservation and protection is critically important. However, it needs to be pinned with strong community buy-in, participation, ensuring that that we're managing the threats to the turtle population. So the question is your thoughts on examples or strategies that will attract community participation and lead to sort of effective government leadership and enforcement so we can ensure that the threats are being reduced on the populations. Who wants to take that one on? Maybe Nick, do you want to start?
I'll say a few words to this, and I couldn't agree with you more, Agnetha, that it's all fine for us to have these national visions and conservation approaches, but without the buy-in of local communities, that's just a dream. And particularly in the Pacific, where you've got such vast distances between centers of government and remote islands where things can happen without any sort of continued monitoring and continued enforcement. So how does one engage a community in being part of this? I can tell you from my time in Palau that one of the things we tried to do was instill a sense of pride. That these were turtles that were nesting on our islands. They were part of our cultural heritage, and all through our time, we've been able to keep these turtles here. Why would today we be willing to let them disappear and go extinct? And that worked really, really well amongst the community I was working with in Palau. It works similarly well along the northern shores of Papua New Guinea on the Morobe coast. And so I think one of the key strategies has to be to get communities to really take pride in the natural resources that they are custodians of. So yeah, that's my input, but I'd love to hear particularly from Vera and Donald, your thoughts on this.
Although, Nick, we're actually at the end of our time, so maybe
yeah, we've been given an extra couple of minutes, so we'll just hear from Donald and Vera on this, and then I'll turn to the poll responses. Who wants to go first? Donald, any thoughts on how we get communities to really buy into this process? Or, yeah, there you go. He's here.
Yeah, I think it's very important to involve the communities in doing more on little issues, like the best thing about the 30 cents. Maybe we really need to go out and try and get more information about this, and we try to put them into maybe write them down, and yeah, but it's very important for us to go back to the communities and do more savings out there.
Vera, a couple of comments from you. You're muted.
Thank you, Nick. I think I've mentioned today one of the important. The strategy would be like most of these sites are, community owned or community, customary areas, and that one of the approaches on which the national government will probably support these community initiatives or activities in turtle monitoring is having these areas formally protected. The other point is actually to have any incentive-based program which will also motivate or actually encourage or support communities to actually carry out their own monitoring program, whether it's like most islands in the Pacific, they are located in remote areas. So actually with these resources, they could actually continue on or, strengthen their monitoring effort in various locations. That adds to having the commitment from the government to ensure that this process or strategy continue supporting those communities. I think the other one is the responsible agency, or the responsible agency at the government level should have this integrated approach where they engage other.
Oops.
Well, it looks like we just lost Vera.
We lost Vera. Oh dear.
While we wait for Vera to come back, we've got just a general comment for everybody to think about, if you like, from Mike, which is, isn't it time that some kind of quality control was introduced for longliners operating Pacific Island waters? Many countries will not allow the import of secondhand cars and trucks that are more than 10 years old. A similar scheme could be considered by countries for vessels wanting to fish in their waters, and every longline should have a spare cabin for an observer. And I note that there's a motion being put to the EU at the moment to not accept seafood that's coming from trawlers that do not use TEDs. you know, that have turtle bycatch. So maybe there's something for us to think about for the Pacific to be following along the same sort of lines.
Yeah, I think that we're going to leave that with everybody in their minds. I really think that it's great, but I do want to just close off with a response to those polls that came through. If you could share the numbers, just cognizant of the fact that we've got a minute or two before we close up, and I wanted to.
They're being shared. Everybody should be able to see them.
Right, and am I correct in, sorry, I can't see the results, but everybody is agreeing that it takes 1,000 eggs to make a turtle?
Correct, and they come back to the same beach they're born on.
Right, so just so that the participants can understand why we put these questions forward, they came as part of an old program I ran on Instagram, Dispelling Turtle Myths, and the reason it's important is because sometimes it might not take 1,000 eggs to make a turtle. If there are big open seagrass pastures where turtles can feed, or coral reefs where turtles can feed, then they will grow faster and reproduce earlier, and it won't take that number of turtles. In a population where there is massive numbers of turtles, then probably there's a lot more competition on resources for food, longer periods to maturity, a lot more competition. But in places where turtle numbers have been declining over the years because of threats, those populations actually have the potential to rebound a lot faster if we do something to remove those threats. We've seen that countless times across the planet, where the minute you remove the threat, be it bycatch, be it direct take, be it harvesting of eggs, the minute that changes, if we think that turtles take 30 years to mature, then you would not expect a result from that until 30 years later. But the truth is we see it 7 to 10 years, 15 years later. And what that tells you is it doesn't take that mythical 1,000 eggs to make an adult. It's a great point to make that it does take a lot of eggs for an adult to survive. But more importantly, if we can remove the pressures, then we do see turtle recoveries really quickly. And then the last point I wanted to make about this: do turtles return to the beach on which they were born? And the answer is really probably not. They return to an area probably within several hundred kilometers of where they were born. So, you know, if you were born in the Western Pacific, you'd head back there rather than, say, the North Central Pacific. Now, in places where you have an isolated island, then chances are they do end up back at that isolated island. But in places where you have multiple islands in close proximity, chances are turtles can move around and pick different islands. And the reason this is important from an ecological and turtle resilience point of view is that turtles can inhabit different islands, and they do come back to different places. And when we're counting turtles, what happens sometimes is we're counting turtles and then they've moved rather than they've gone down in numbers. And so it's really important for us to get a good handle on what that regional spatial distribution of turtles and the return is, rather than just thinking that that turtle comes back to that nesting beach. And if you want to know why people think it's that way, it's because once an adult does lay eggs on that beach, it's really, really good at coming back to that precise beach. And I think historically it was that ability for a turtle to keep on coming back to the same beach that led many people to thinking, oh, well, this is the beach on which it was born. So I just wanted to put those two things out there because they're very relevant to how this model will look at turtle data, and particularly look at spatial distribution and potential for survival, particularly if we start removing some of those pressures early on. With that, I think we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank Donald and Job and Simon and Vera for having joined us as panelists. I really, really appreciate your insights, your thoughts. Jamie, thank you for the introduction. Anissa and Karen, Junie, thank you so much for the behind the scenes logistics. I hope all of the participants have enjoyed what we've been able to present. today. And as I said right at the very beginning, if you have specific questions for me, please find me in the speaker profile list and whatever, and send me a direct message. I would be happy to communicate with you. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for everything you've done, and good day to you all.